Someone asked me how I adapt to prison life, especially being wrongly convicted. And it's not so much about adapting to prison life, it's about creating my own inner world that has a protective barrier of meditation and like exercise, having clear goals for my future, like making my mind not in this place. You know, if they say that heaven is in the mind, if you integrate your mind into your whole body, then your whole body is going to be full of heaven. You know what I mean? So no matter where you are, you can create that environment.
The world first knew him as Kai. Not a last name, not a fixed identity, not someone you could pin down to a hometown or a proper biography. Just Kai, a kid with the wiry hair of a free spirit, the sunburned face of a wanderer, and the kind of smile that suggested he had learned to live outside of the world's boundaries. He introduced himself to television cameras in 2013 as though the world had been waiting for him all along, like some roadside prophet who appeared out of the haze of asphalt and exhaust fumes. But before that single moment of virality, before the internet claimed him as a meme, Kai had been living in the shadows of highways, couches, alleys, and borrowed spaces. His life was scattered across bus stops, freight trains, and chance encounters. He had no clear origin story, only the fragments he chose to reveal. And even those came half-drenched in myth. He would later tell interviewers that he had left home early, that his parents weren't safe to be around, that he had grown up around people who hurt him in ways he still couldn't fully name. Whether those claims were true or exaggerated, no one could ever pin down. The point was that Kai had learned early. He picked up survival tricks that most suburban kids couldn't imagine: how to charm strangers for a meal, how to crash on the floors of friends, how to make yourself invisible when police swept through with flashlights looking for runaways. He was a drifter in the classic American sense, carrying nothing but a backpack, a skateboard, and whatever instruments of self-preservation he trusted. There was something magnetic about him. People he met on the road often recalled that Kai seemed larger than life, like someone lifted from the pages of a Jack Kerouac novel. He could play the guitar and sing in raspy tones that made you forget he was just a kid living rough. He could smoke a joint with strangers one moment, and then launch into a philosophical tangent about the beauty of sunsets the next. But there was also a volatility there, a flicker in his eyes that suggested storms gathered beneath the surface. He was the kind of person who could win your affection in minutes, but also someone you sensed might turn sharp if cornered. That volatility came into sharp focus one winter day in February 2013, when Kai hitched a ride in Fresno, California. Being the Messiah, blood on the pavement, a dazed worker struggling for his life. Into that madness, Kai stepped forward, and in that moment, the drifter became something else entirely. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have a knife. What he had was a hatchet, a camping tool he carried in his backpack, a symbol of his wandering survivalist identity. And with that hatchet, Kai lunged forward. He later demonstrated it for the cameras with almost theatrical energy. Smash, smash, S-U-H-mash. 3 quick blows delivered to McBride's head, enough to incapacitate him and stop the attack. Kai had become an unlikely hero, a hitchhiker turned vigilante. A man whose instinct to protect strangers had overpowered his instinct to run. The police who arrived on scene didn't know what to make of him at first. Kai wasn't a typical witness. He rambled, he spoke in slang, he seemed just as likely to laugh as to curse. But in his version of the story, it was simple. A man was trying to kill people, and Kai had stepped in to stop him. He didn't ask for a reward. He didn't want credit. He spoke about it like it was nothing more than what anyone should do. Yet the rawness of his account, the energy in his voice, the strange charisma that spilled out of him, made it clear that this was no ordinary drifter. That charisma exploded onto the internet when a Fresno news crew interviewed him in the aftermath. The reporter, realizing there was something about Kai's energy that demanded to be filmed, let the camera roll as Kai told the story in his own words. It was messy, disorganized, and unforgettable. Within hours, the video was uploaded to YouTube. Within days, it had been watched millions of times. The internet had discovered a new folk hero, a hatchet-wielding hitchhiker who embodied some primal idea of justice. The wanderer who saved innocence from a maniac with nothing more than his courage and a camping tool. But behind that viral clip, Kai remained who he always had been, a young man with no fixed address, couch surfing, drifting, carrying scars he rarely spoke about, Fame came at him like a tidal wave, but at that moment in February, before the memes, before the offers, before the cameras chased him, he was still just a hitchhiker on the side of the road, catching a ride that would change his life forever. What the cameras couldn't see was how complicated he truly was. That day in Fresno painted him as a folk hero, but the story of Kai was never going to stay that simple. The same qualities that made him magnetic and unpredictable on camera would soon become cracks in the mask, widening with every passing month until they swallowed the legend whole. But in that first viral moment, the world saw only the savior, the free spirit, the barefoot drifter with a hatchet in hand. And they loved him for it. For Kai, though, the question lingered quietly. Even in those early days of internet fame, what happens to someone like him when the road stops being just a road and starts being a spotlight? Could a hitchhiker who had learned to survive by vanishing into the margins ever survive being at the center of the world's attention? Those answers would come in time, and they would be darker than anyone watching that first clip could have imagined. The interview had been just 3 minutes long, a messy roadside retelling of a surreal attack. But it was enough. By the time Kai disappeared from Fresno that day, wandering off in his baggy pants and scruffy hoodie, the internet had already claimed him. The local station's upload shot across social media like wildfire. Within hours, it was being shared on Reddit threads and Facebook feeds, remixed into music tracks, subtitled in multiple languages. The phrase smash, smash, mash became a rallying cry of absurd heroism, a reminder that the strangest people could become the face of justice in an instant. Kai had entered the bloodstream of the internet age at full velocity. Overnight, he was transformed from an anonymous drifter into a folk legend with millions of fans. His shaggy hair, his chill surfer cadence, the way he cursed mid-sentence and yet still spoke with a kind of poetic rhythm. It all clicked with a generation raised on memes. There was no real plan of where he was going. Reporters swarmed him. Kai leaned into it in his own strange way. He strummed guitars for journalists, spoke about love and peace in one breath, then ranted about dark memories in another. His contradictions only deepened the fascination. He was a savior who didn't want saving himself, a hero who couldn't stay put long enough to be celebrated properly. It didn't take long before national media circled. Jimmy Kimmel's late-night show reached out, flying Kai to Los Angeles for an interview. Viewers tuned in, expecting perhaps a cleaned-up version of the viral hitchhiker. What they got was Kai in all his rawness, barefoot on the set, laughing with a nervous energy, answering questions in unpredictable tangents. One moment he was charming, the next moment he was veering into odd anecdotes about mushrooms or the universe. The audience laughed, partly with him and partly at him. Still, the clip went viral again. The myth grew, turned Kai into a brand. But Kai recoiled. He wasn't someone you could put in a suit or polish into a digestible package. Every attempt to commercialize him sudden spotlight magnified it as weeks turned into months. Cracks began to show. Kai's past started to seep out in fragments. He gave interviews where he spoke about childhood abuse, about being locked away, about being violated in ways he still couldn't put into words. Selves never stopped pulling at him. The internet, of course, had no patience for nuance. They made songs out of his words, memes out of his face. They laughed at his eccentricities without understanding the pain beneath them. Kai had become content, not a man, not a story, but a punchline they could loop endlessly. And while that meme status gave him a strange form of immortality, it also left him even more isolated. He was no longer anonymous, yet he was still homeless. He was recognized everywhere, yet he had nowhere stable to sleep. He had millions of fans, yet no family or close circle to protect him from himself. Offers faded. Because Kai could not be tamed into a marketable product, the reality of his situation grew stark. He was still drifting, still catching rides with strangers, still trusting his safety to the randomness of the road. But now, he was doing it under the gaze of millions. Some who adored him, others who mocked him, and many who wanted a piece of his legend for themselves. By summer 2013, Kai was showing signs of spiraling. He got into confrontations, ranted about people trying to exploit him, claimed shadowy figures were following him. Friends described him as paranoid, talking about being drugged or targeted. He slept wherever he could, sometimes in parks, sometimes on couches of fans who invited him in. His instability was impossible to hide. The hero image was starting to crack, and people who had once cheered for him now whispered about whether Kai was okay, or whether the hatchet-wielding hitchhiker might not be as harmless as he once seemed. It was during this fragile time that he began to drift eastward, moving out of California, searching for something like belonging, or maybe just running from the ghosts that followed him. His path led him toward New Jersey, thousands of miles away, where a chance encounter with a man named Joseph Galfi would change everything. Kai, who had once been hailed as the embodiment of viral heroism, was on a collision course with a darker story, one that would not end in applause, but in handcuffs. The boy who had laughed into cameras about smashing evil would soon face accusations of his own. And the internet, which had built him up overnight, was about to turn on him just as fast. By the fall of 2013, the glow of virality had already dimmed. The internet had moved on, as it always does, to the next meme, the next sensation. Kai was still remembered. People still recognized him at bus stations, still shouted smash, smash, smash when they spotted him in public, but the wave that had lifted him had crested. What remained was a young man still living out of a backpack, still carrying no real plan for tomorrow. His legend had been built on a single act of violence turned heroism, but the life behind it had never been stable enough to sustain the spotlight that he drifted eastward. Some said he was trying to escape the chaos of California. Others believed he was chasing a new start in places where nobody cared about YouTube virality. He hopped trains, thumbed rides, sometimes scraped together cash from strangers who recognized him. Other times simply disappeared into shelters or the couches of people who offered him kindness. To those who met him on the road, he was still captivating. He had that strange charisma that made you lean in, wanting to know more. But just beneath that charm was something harder, a paranoia that had begun to consume him. Kai spoke more and more about being abused in childhood, about not trusting authority, about shadows chasing him. He told people he had been drugged before, that men had tried to take advantage of him while he was passed out. He seemed to live in a world where danger was always just behind him, and where the only way to stay safe was to keep moving, keep drifting, never let anyone get too close. His free-spirited hitchhiker identity, once endearing, now looked like a shield against demons no one else could see. It was in this fragile state that he crossed paths with Joseph Galfi. Joseph was a 73-year-old attorney living in Clark, New Jersey. He was a respected member of his community, a man who had built his life around order, law, and the quiet routines of suburban respectability. On the surface, Galfi and Kai could not have been more different. One was a young, rootless drifter. The other was an older professional nearing the twilight of his years. But the road has a way of throwing opposites together. Somehow, their lives intersected. The story of how they met has never been fully clear. Some accounts suggest Kai was hitchhiking and accepted Galfi's offer of a place to stay. Others hint they might have crossed paths through social media or chance encounters in town. What is certain is that on May 12, 2013, Kai ended up at Galfi's home. What happened inside those walls became the center of one of the most disturbing true crime cases of the decade. According to Kai's later account, Galfi drugged and assaulted him. Kai would tell police, and later, a jury, that he had passed out and awoken to find himself being violated. He claimed it was an attack that mirrored the very fears he had been voicing for months. The paranoia of being taken advantage of while vulnerable. For Kai, it was the nightmare scenario, made real, but investigators pieced together a different picture. On May 13th, Galfi failed to show up for work. Concerned, colleagues asked police to check on him. When officers entered his home, they found him dead, lying on the floor of his bedroom, wearing only underwear and socks. His body showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head and face. The respectable attorney was now the victim of a brutal beating, and the only person last known to have been with him was K.A.I.by then. Kai was already gone. He had fled Galfi's house and taken to the road again, posting erratic updates on Facebook, ranting cryptically about being drugged and raped. His posts read less like confession and more like the outbursts of someone spiraling. Accusations, half-coherent descriptions of abuse, vague declarations of self-defense. For followers who still adored the hatchet-wielding hitchhiker, the posts were disturbing. For law enforcement, they were evidence that pointed directly to him. A nationwide manhunt began. News outlets picked up the story. The viral hero, the folk legend, was now wanted for murder. The same face that had smiled into cameras just months earlier was plastered across wanted posters and news segments. People who had once celebrated Kai now watched in disbelief as his name became synonymous not with heroism, but with brutality. Police for rides, sleeping wherever he could. The myth of Kai collided with the machinery of law enforcement, and for the first time, the drifter who had always managed to vanish found himself trapped in a spotlight he couldn't escape. That on May 16, 2013, authorities arrested Kai in a Greyhound bus terminal in Philadelphia. He was disheveled, tired, but still carried that air of unpredictability. To the officers who placed him in handcuffs, it was surreal. This was the internet's folk hero, reduced to another fugitive caught at the end of the line. The arrest sent shockwaves. Fans clung to the idea that he had acted in self-defense, that the system was railroading a young man who had saved lives only months earlier. Detractors pointed to the brutality of Galfi's injuries, arguing this was not self-defense but rage, maybe even revenge. The truth was clouded by Kai's own erratic storytelling, shifting details, and the absence of anyone else who had been inside that house. For Kai, the jail cell marked the end of the road. No more couches, no more trains, no more sudden bursts of fame. Just the grinding machinery of the justice system, a system he had distrusted all his life. And as the trial loomed, the question was no longer about whether Kai was a folk hero or a meme. It was whether he was guilty of cold-blooded murder or the tragic victim of the very abuse he had been shouting about all along. The world had cheered when he smashed a hatchet into a violent maniac in Fresno. Now they watched as he faced accusations of smashing a 73-year-old attorney to death in his own bedroom. It was the fall of a folk hero, a descent as rapid and bewildering as his rise, and the story was far from over. The trial would stretch on for years, dragging Kai's name through headlines, exposing every contradiction, every instability, every wound that had shaped him. The legend of the hatchet-wielding hitchhiker was about to become something darker, something tragic, something that would leave even his most loyal fans questioning whether they had ever truly known him at all. The courtroom was the last place Kai had ever wanted to be. For years he had trusted the road to keep him free, moving fast enough that no one could pin him down. But now the walls closed in on him, the air sterile, the proceedings heavy with ritual. The boy who once rambled into cameras about smashing, was forced into a suit, his wrists shackled, his words filtered through lawyers and cross-examinations. It was a stage, but not the kind Kai could control. The state of New Jersey charged him with murder. The 3-year-old attorney had been beaten to death in his own home, and Kai was the last person seen with him. The victim's body bore signs of blunt force trauma, the kind not explained by a defensive struggle, assaulted, powerless, the very nightmare he had long carried in his mind. To the jury, he was no longer the viral hero but a man claiming to be another kind of victim. The trouble was that Kai's words, so captivating on the street and in memes, didn't carry the same clarity under oath. He rambled, he contradicted himself, he lost his temper. The very qualities that had made him unforgettable on camera now worked against him in court. Reporters covering the trial noted his volatility. One day he was calm, almost detached. The next day he was shouting about conspiracies, accusing lawyers, or railing against authority. The jury watched a young man unravel in real time. His testimony was not the tidy story of a victim seeking justice, but the chaotic stream of someone whose inner world was fractured. The prosecution pounced on those cracks. They pointed to the brutality of the injuries, the inconsistency of Kai's account, the absence of physical evidence to support his claims of being drugged. They painted him not as a hero or a victim, but as a violent drifter whose instability had finally erupted in murder. Outside the courthouse, the narrative fractured too. Some of Kai's fans still clung to the idea that he was innocent, that the system was silencing him, that he had been punished simply for being too free. Others, once charmed by his eccentricity, now saw a dangerous edge. The internet that had built his legend now fed on his downfall, turning his mugshots and trial footage into new content, stripped of the humanity beneath it. For Kai, the trial was a cruel mirror. In Fresno, his violence had made him a savior. In New Jersey, his violence made him a monster. The same hatchet that had been a symbol of justice was now the ghost haunting every word of testimony. Had he acted to save himself, or had he unleashed a rage that had been simmering all along? In April 2019, 6 years after the killing, the verdict came down, guilty of first-degree murder. The jury had not believed his self-defense claim. For the state, it was justice served. For Kai, it was the end of the road. The sentence was severe, 57 years in prison. For a man who had once embodied freedom itself, who had lived by hitching rides and vanishing across state lines, the weight of decades behind bars was almost incomprehensible. He would be in his 70s before even the possibility of release. Older than Galfi had been when they crossed paths in prison, Kai continued to insist on his version of events. He wrote letters, gave interviews, posted messages through supporters. He claimed the system had failed him, that he had been punished for speaking out, that powerful forces had conspired against him. His paranoia deepened, his words more frantic. Some who had once cheered for him saw only tragedy now, a man broken by trauma and swallowed by a system he could never navigate. The internet moved on again. Kai's story became a cautionary tale, a documentary subject, a headline that resurfaced whenever Netflix or YouTube rediscovered the oddity of his rise and fall. The boy who had once been a meme was now a prisoner, his legend preserved in a 3-minute roadside interview and his downfall carved into court records. Yet the fascination lingered. Because Kai had embodied something raw and primal, the idea that ordinary people, even drifters, could stand up to violence with nothing but courage and a blunt instrument. His act in Fresno had been real, and for a moment it had made the world believe in unlikely heroes. But the darkness that followed raised questions too uncomfortable to ignore. Was Kai ever really a hero? Or was he always a troubled soul destined for collapse? Was the internet guilty of elevating someone without understanding the pain beneath the surface? The tragedy of Kai is not just the murder of Joseph Galfi, though that alone is devastating. It is also the story of what happens when a wounded, unstable young man is thrust into the machinery of viral fame without protection, without guidance, without a net. The same qualities that made him magnetic, his rawness, his volatility, his unpredictability, made him unfit for the spotlight, and when the spotlight burned too hot, it consumed him. Now, behind bars, Kai remains a paradox. To some, he is a fallen angel of the internet age, a warning about hero worship and the dangers of virality. To others, he is simply a murderer, stripped of the myth, remembered not for smash, but for the life he took. What is undeniable is that his story belongs to the strange archive of our times. The way the internet can create legends in a day and destroy them just as quickly. Kai was the hitchhiker who carried a hatchet, who stepped into violence to protect strangers, who then spiraled into a violence of his own. His life was a road with no map. And in the end, that road led not to freedom, but to a cell where the walls are higher than any highway he ever hitchhiked. The boy who once drifted barefoot through America will now walk only the narrow yards of prison. The hatchet that once defined him is long gone. What remains is the ghost of a viral moment and the long, painful aftermath of a man who could never escape himself.